Welcome, everybody, to our next Blueprints for Success episode. Today, I'm really delighted to have Jessica Talisman with us today. She'll be talking about information, data, ontologies, all kinds of things related to enterprise architecture, change, etc. So, welcome, Jessica. It's great to have you on board.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here.
So, let's start a little bit around you. So, tell us about Jessica. Um, what do you do? What things that really make you tick, and what things maybe not so much? Give us a bit of your story.
Okay. I am a senior information architect at Adobe right now, which is, in my opinion, an honor because it's a company that has content management systems and analytics. So working directly with those products is very exciting. I have a library and information science background and also a master's in teaching. So I do combine both of those skill
Hmm.
sets and learnings and degrees. I have worked as a senior taxonomist and enterprise architect in different industries. So I really started in the late 90s. I've worked in government, I've worked ed tech, ad tech. So the whole range. Right before Adobe, I was with Amazon. So working as an information
Nice.
architect was really insightful. And each and every experience I think has built upon the last. And I really love what I do. So
Good. That's really good. And information architecture is quite interesting. So maybe for those who don't know what that means, maybe if
mhm.
you can just explain a little bit around, in a nutshell, what is information architecture?
Not to complicate things, but there's two, I think, information architecture domains. One is focused on UX and UI, and
Yeah.
that's more the design and front end. So when you see a navigation experience or something that ties into the user of a site, that's one aspect. And the other aspect is working more with back end data. It can be taxonomies, ontologies, controlled vocabularies, indexing, and so information architects, at least within my sphere, work with organizing and connecting data across a business landscape.
Which is for those audience out there who are architects or analysts or enterprise architects, this is really your bread and butter stuff. So
Yeah.
managing information and all of that. So thanks
And
for
I
clearing
work
that up.
I work closely with analysts, and that's what's interesting is there's just a real natural partnership with
Yeah.
analysts and information architecture because we need each other. The way we can deliver value is to help others, and I think it's a really collaborative
Yeah.
um,
I would
setup.
definitely agree with you because I think analysts really struggle to find information in organizations. It is not easy. And having some architecture in place is super helpful. Yeah, I often say it's like a library, right? You want something cataloged and curated. You know where to find that information. If it's just all in boxes, it's going to be real hard to find.
Very
So
hard.
that's a great example. Yeah. All right. So maybe let's talk a bit about your career. So how did you start?
Mhm.
What were the key turning points for you into this area and this field? We know that this area, I imagine specifically in the early 2000s, was very male dominated. So what are the key points for you in this career?
Yes, it's interesting because the way I started was well before my master's. I was an undergrad. I had gone through my teaching program, but I got a job as a visual history cataloger, working with
Oh,
11 years of footage. So it was actually a Steven Spielberg project. It's called the Shoah
nice.
Foundation for Visual History, and he patented, I think he might have 9 patents on this technology. We see it everywhere today, even with YouTube, where you're able to mark up video and slice it into clips. And we had to build controlled vocabulary, thesauri. It was an information landscape where we were tagging and connecting everything from events to temporal and spatial data using VHS and computers.
Wow.
And so it was very technologically advanced at that time. That's how I started. It was very complex to build that because the idea of the system is that any end user could go in and search for anything they were interested in learning about World War II, and they could pull up that exact 2 to 3 minute clip or as many as would populate or come up with the search results. And that same technology was applied, obviously advanced, and that foundation, Showa Foundation, is still alive, and they've extended the project, and it's pretty
Wow.
exciting to watch. And so that
Yeah.
was really where I started. And I could say that I had an interest in library. I was a history major, so it was a very natural transition because I think there's lots of parallels with organizing and architecting systems.
Yeah. I really like the correlation with libraries. The way, if you go back in time, back to the Alexandria in Egypt, the whole thing was bringing that knowledge together, putting it into a library system, and making it available for people to grow and learn even more. So here it's just in the digital space, right? So it's helping sharing that information with some purpose, put it that way.
And what's interesting is that libraries were the ones to first digitize. So,
Yeah.
and come up with these organizational schemes. And I think it's often overlooked or forgotten. And a lot of the practices haven't changed much when we made the transition from analog to digital. The same foundations apply. And
Yeah.
I think we overlook it or we forget or we don't draw the correlation between the two. But what libraries have done, library and information science has done within the technology space is so impressive. It's part of the very foundation of the internet. So
Yes, it is.
the organization of documents.
I think people just see it as a place where books are, and they don't really truly understand the nature of doing that entire thing. It's the cataloging, the categorizing, all of that stuff forms that foundation of information architecture, any kind of architecture that we're doing really, in the digital space, of course. They said they call the 90s the dark ages of internet architecture. I think there was a term somewhere that I heard. It might not have been quite correct because a lot of people just went to the next technology, but they didn't actually keep the old tools and ways in which they were digitizing at the time, and then they couldn't reuse them. It was quite an interesting, I think it was like a movie or a short video or something that I watched about the craziness of all of this data that was lost because they used different technology and they just couldn't retrieve some of that stuff. I don't know if you've heard about
And yeah,
that.
and like within the information, within the library science space, if you look at the history of digitization, one thing that has plagued us because of technology changes, we call it bit rot, which is that data loss that happens when you have technology that ages or where that we lack that interoperability because the technology changes fundamentally.
Mm.
And you could look at Betamax or old video game consoles, all of that same vein where it's really you have to have emulators in order to understand the data. And when I was in graduate school, one thing that was interesting, got a scholarship to do this, the National Book Fair in Washington, D.C., which was amazing. And it was just a way to immerse and go to the archives and national archives in Washington, D.C. And I remember distinctly that they had a floor of all new microfiche readers because of all the technologies that was the most reliable for archival purposes. So when we start to think of technological advances, but then we start to look at the long game involves preservation as well. And that's something I'm really intrigued with right now.
Yeah, it
Mhm.
is fascinating because that's a lot of work. That really is a lot of work. And even from a personal perspective, when you look at photos that were taken with the old cameras and things, and most of them were printed out and then you store them, there's an advantage with that. But then also you look at the digital stuff, if you lose your phone or, if something you can't remember your password and you can't get back into systems, it can have a personal effect on access to that information that you used to have. So,
I will never, this is a personal antidote, but When I have two kids who are young adults now, and when my daughter was born and we had all of our photos, it was probably the first 6 months. It was when Apple had their cloud, it was their early cloud called Mobile Me. Me was a storage platform, much iCloud, and it was phased out. But something happened and we lost every single photo because we were so trusting. And now
Terrible.
we know to do like backups.
Terrible.
So my daughter still jokes that maybe she's adopted because she's missing like a segment of her life. But it's super interesting because we don't think of that. Maybe we think of it in our own internal systems, but the way that the practice of archiving longevity, making sure that our files are connected, that there's that lineage, the historical lineage is really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. I think people can feel it when it happens to them, but they don't necessarily understand that in the business environment. Zero now, but in certain industries, building industry, for instance, law, etc., you've got to store that information for a significant amount of time. Some of it is 7 years, some of it's even longer. And what do you do with that? What happens if you upgrade your CRM system and your file format doesn't work? I had a similar thing. I used a different laptop, and I didn't remember that when I used Pages on Microsoft, I couldn't open any of those Word documents.
Microsoft
And not Microsoft, sorry, in Apple.
and
Just, I can't open this stuff. How am I going to do this? And that was just a simple example. So I imagine with big corporations who are doing these upgrades, they're not thinking of all that uh, content that could be lost without having the systems.
And that's like a whole nother avenue. And it was something that I did explore early on. My sister-in-law is an archivist. And so a lot of larger businesses, and especially in film and television and those sorts of domains, even healthcare, automobile manufacturing, they have archivists or they have a staff librarian. And it's intriguing but necessary as well for that historical record and for legal purposes. It's very
Yeah.
important for records management and the idea of keeping files in three different places to safeguard.
Yes.
Those practices
Especially.
are really important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I worked with a company that had employed a librarian, and I thought it was quite forward thinking, actually, because everyone thinks it's like old school, but the librarian was there to archive and catalog and manage the data, which was fascinating. I was like, I quite
And
like that.
that's what's so interesting is I don't think the industry in general, globally, the tech industry, has really landed on a title that's appropriate for what I do. And information architecture makes sense because it's more all encompassing. I've been called, senior taxonomist and ontologist. There's a full range of titles, but in the end, we're focused on the same thing. And if we were to get to that root of the field or the domain, it really is being a librarian in a
Yeah.
way, because those are the practices that we're
Yeah.
applying.
Yeah.
So,
All right. Next question. In your own words, how would you describe the importance of your role in today's organizations?
I saw a big uptick in need and demand around 2019 or 20. And it really turned and you started seeing a lot. There's a funny trend in the job postings is I notice a trend that at the end or the beginning of a new quarter, there's a flood of data organization type roles, whether it be data steward, information architect, taxonomist. And I think it's that when we look at failures globally, the person that can unravel or untangle that ball of yarn, the person who can come up with a strategic plan to address data issues, it could be data portability, data interoperability, there's categorizations part of it, but it is a specific discipline. And so I think the importance, because we invested more in technical infrastructure with COVID, with all of us working from home and reliance on technology, there was a huge uptick
Yeah.
in that role and the importance. The unfortunate thing is because you hire one person, I will sometimes look across the room and see these teams of really robust teams of engineers that are analysis, analytics, data analytics team or BI team. It's very rare to have an information architecture team.
Yeah.
So it is very important, but I find that in most roles, I'm stretched pretty thin with resources.
Mm.
I've had one or two direct reports here and there, but generally it's
Yeah.
high demand, much needed, under resourced.
Yeah. I would
Mhm.
agree with you. I think there's a tendency to focus more on doing bits, like what is doing versus structuring things. And not seeing that structuring things reduces the amounts of doing that's required because you're structuring it, you're not running in circles, right? But then they go, how many people need to do this?
Mhm.
And you end up having all these doers waiting for instructions on how to structure this. Yeah, I would agree with you. It's what do you put in first, the cart before the horse, or that kind of thing. And
Mhm.
it's not easy to structure things if they haven't been structured previously.
Mhm.
If they're there, it's great, right? It's
Right.
maintenance, but it's
And
not.
also it needs to be reassessed. And I find myself going in, and the first thing I always do is audit the system. I perform content analysis, category analysis, coverage. I create a coverage model. So you go through a lot of the same sort of data science, data engineering, and data analytics type of assessments.
Mm,
But the value and the decisions that you derive from that analysis are much different, and the scope without a team is pretty massive.
yeah,
Mhm.
I believe you.
Yes.
I know with architecture, business architecture, we look at information mapping. So we look on the definitions, understanding how information is defined within the organization, because what is, let's say, a customer means to one group is not always the same as what it means to another group. And especially if you're looking at using AI, giving
Mhm.
it some clues as to what the definition of what you mean is going to be super helpful, right? And I think people don't think like that. They just think AI is going to automatically know
Yeah,
exactly what you mean when you use a word, but that's not typically my
it's
experience.
absolutely not the case. And so that is so important, that exercise of defining, because it also can help to stimulate dialogue
Yeah.
amongst people. So what one person might call title and the another person calls name in a
Mhm.
schema field or with any sort of catalog, that reconciling those differences and being able to construct agreements, but also align throughout the organization. Because ideally, like in a successful, highly performant business, we shouldn't be having to spend or waste time, I should say, squabbling about naming conventions if it's architected
Yes.
correctly or about definitions. Be able to have a conversation and use coherent and symbiotic relation or language. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
mhm.
I agree. And often that's what happens. Everyone goes, yeah, we agree. That's called that. But then you read the detail and they go, oh, no, that wasn't what I meant. And we shouldn't be squabbling about it. And we need to spend some time on it, but we also shouldn't be spending too much time on it because sometimes you have to make decisions and
Mhm.
just accept that's what we're going to catalog it as. And we just agree with it and we carry on because otherwise you'll go around in circles.
Yeah,
So,
and I because I have a methodology for that. This is my way of managing that. Is I normally use an upper level ontology. It's a standard. It's a WC3 standard, and it's SCOS. It's an upper
mm,
ontology. It's a schema that is machine readable, translatable, and it structures hierarchies. But what's really nice is you can leverage, much like in a JSON schema, alt label, an alternative label. And
okay,
so label.
nice.
So there's an appropriated preferred label.
Yeah.
and then preferred label associated with that, if you think there's one governing identifier for that one label,
Yeah.
you can populate all of the alt labels you want, and then everyone wins and everyone has
Yeah.
their language and nomenclature included in that catalog. And programmatically, that works. It's encoded that way in JSON or XML. So then it actually helps improve search because it'll capture all of those,
But still keep it in the right category, which is okay. That's really great.
and I'm like, but I feel and believe that finding those solutions to help to move people forward, to continue to have those conversations and not get stuck
Yeah.
in that space.
I recently spoke to Bill Ulrich or William Ulrich, whichever version, and he was saying a lot of people get what he calls stuck in startup mode when it comes to building kind of their knowledge base in their organization. They're so busy trying to make it perfect, they're not recognizing that you start with something
Yes.
and that's how you start and you refine it and you improve it. But yes, as to your point, you can set something as the lead and then have all those alternatives that might feed the information required, as you mentioned. So that's good. That's awesome.
Yeah,
All right.
I'm very appreciative of that right now.
Yeah.
This yes.
It would be great to see some of those models and typically to see how they would integrate with something like your business architecture or those kind of things. It's fascinating. I think there's a lot of synergy and there's a lot of similarity as well. But I think there's maybe more opportunity to really look at information concepts as an architectural practice more so as a glossary type of piece. I think there's some scope for that broader view. All right. Do you have a project or an initiative that you felt having information architecture really changed the game?
I do. There's a few that I can think of, but the I when I was at Overstock, which is now Bed Bath and Beyond, so that's e-commerce, and COVID had just happened, or we were all sent home and working from home for the
Yeah.
first time. And of course, most people found hobbies, and I was thrown a project to build Overstock's government site, which was to sell behind government firewall, which extended now to nonprofits and businesses, I believe. And so it was building a completely new architecture and a new taxonomy, essentially, but it had to connect with the SKUs on the normal Overstock site. So a lot of mapping. But building that and launching that completely new with a really nice discovery, it followed a really, I learned something. So what I took from your question is more like that was game changing, was also game changing for me. I had one simple constraint, which was that there could be 8 categories, and each of those 8 categories could have 8, and each of those 8 could have 8, and that was it. So it was like a really finite, it was a really nice thing to design for, knowing how it would flow through from the back end to the front end. And so having to change to create this other business or enterprise commerce site, having when I joined Overstock, I had just left the Department of Justice in the US. So it was an ode to the work I had done because it was going to be behind government firewalls for government purchasing, and then having to translate what the experience and my work from the front end of the site into this net new site with a different customer base. It's really exciting to see that site is still up. And yeah, and that it was successful. I think it was a game changer in a way for the business, just to be able to launch such an ambitious project with competition. There were only 2 other competitors that were sitting behind the government firewall. So it was Amazon and Fisher Scientific. So
Yeah, that's pretty significant.
it was a great experience. So both for myself, and I think it's something I'm really proud of.
Yeah. And I don't think people really understand that simplicity is actually difficult to do. It's
Right.
not easy to create simplicity in your modeling because you
Yeah.
think, oh, what about this and what about this? It's actually quite a complex. So maybe if you can explain just a little bit, you were saying how you could break it down, but what was your thinking around doing that?
I will tell you that there's user research, which we had very little of. So usually marketing and other stakeholders, category managers, at least in e-commerce, will give you insight and derive some of what they expect in terms of how things might be organized or named. Everything in terms of all the categories was completely renamed for the
Mm,
purpose of the site because it was a different audience and we didn't really have user research.
yeah.
So just taking the whole idea of it, we tend to like to populate with phrases or ambiguous names. Those are the two distinct extremes that I see. And neither, in my opinion, is ideal. Ambiguity is the death of a product because, for example, if you just simply have the word accessories, it makes no sense unless it's contextualized. Um,
Yeah.
but then also not being too verbose, so using common language. Simplicity of designing so that it flows. There's certain things to think of instead of racking your brain so much for exactly what something should be called like an absolute perfection. Building those types of structures, be it like a taxonomy or navigation structure or backend schema structure that will connect everything, really has to do with storytelling in the
Yeah.
end. And
Yeah.
so you're telling a story from broad to narrow,
Yeah.
from things that are related to each other. And I think we've all experienced where you're looking for data and that ambiguity, like accessories, and then all of a sudden at the same level, you might have like gloves or those accessories. So the simplicity of it is the idea that everything, my theory and my way of practice, everything must have a home, that to remove ambiguity, so everything must have a definition. So I
Hmm.
apply definitions as I'm building as a practice for that
Yeah.
very reason. It will come in handy later for especially with AI.
Yeah.
So that becomes training data. And in order to keep things more simple in its construct, there should be no other
Hmm.
and no miscellaneous and no NA because those junk drawers are going to grow and that adds complexity to your system
Mm.
because it's everything that you essentially don't care about or that you just can't gain consensus around. So it's important to have simplicity, but I think the exercise of getting rid of those ancillary categories that end up, it's called category stuffing
Yeah.
when we do that.
Yeah. And that happens a lot. It
It
does
happens.
because you think, oh, I just forgot this and I'm going to pop that in there. And then next minute you're like, where did this come from? What does this mean?
Yeah,
Now, you touched on AI, and I'm curious. How good is AI at doing that kind of thing?
not very. Fortunately, and I'm not sure. I always wonder because like everyone else, I've played with having AI and different AI models, 6 different models create taxonomies for me. And because when you work in the IA space, most people that are a certain level are familiar with all of the taxonomies that are broadly out there and available.
Yeah.
And so someone will generate a taxonomy from ChatGPT, for example, that has to do with I don't we at one point in my career it was veterans this couple a
Mhm.
year ago. So it was health and medical. So it was trying to create a taxonomy out of that prompting with a couple of different models. It basically replicated the browse structure of the Department of Veterans Affairs in the United States.
Okay, that's
So
fascinating.
if you think of what AI is trained on broadly, the training data, it's from publicly open
Yeah.
sources of data, right? So it's the internet.
Yeah.
So, and the same is true like NIH, National Institute of Health in the States. openly has their taxonomies and ontologies available for download.
Mm-hmm.
So when, that's what you're going to get essentially is something like that. However, the one issue I have is whenever I have attempted to create some sort of structure from AI, you end up with ambiguous categories, nonsensical hierarchies with relationship clashes, and just a lot of ambiguity.
Yeah.
So you're still going to have to put in quite a lot of work.
Yeah.
And the issue is that if you don't have someone that's experienced and educated in this discipline,
They'll just accept it.
you're
Yeah.
going to say, okay, accessories is my level 1 category. That's great. And you can imagine, like, accessories is pretty all encompassing. Anything could really be an accessory to what. So it I think it's right now a little bit dangerous, that just in trust. I think with most things, I think that I do believe that AI though is great when it has robust training data and ideally a knowledge graph to
Yeah.
help to steer it. So
I would agree with you. A similar experience in architecture, business architecture, for instance, is when you try build the capabilities of an organization, right? And capabilities, you can't have the ands in there. It's got to be specific capability to that organization. And when you run that through ChatGPT, it cannot distinguish between a human capability, as in a competency, and a marketing pitch and a architectural structure. And so you do have to train it to do the right thing. It's really good once you have those structures, though.
yes.
Like it can fill in the gaps. I find that's certainly what I've discovered, but you still have to architect. So as you were saying, you still have to architect the straw man as
Mhm.
to what you need to have there, that human in the loop
Yep.
process. But it's really good once you've gone through that human side of it, it's really good at producing content based on the structures that you create for it. But
As long
not,
as you remove the firstly, secondly, thirdly, in conclusion. So there's like a very transparent format.
yes, exactly, exactly. It does have its challenges, and I think there's a lot of move now towards it not just being single scripts, but a whole lot of tasks that needs to occur. So I think there's a lot of here was my other question that I had for you, just based on your conversation. So for those who don't know much about ontologies or anything like that, when we talk about modeling, there's often three types of modeling, and I'm just generalizing, so please forgive me for that. But you've got conceptual modeling, which is the idea. So we conceptualizing this idea. And then you've got, what's it called? No, the last one's physical model. And then what's the middle one? I don't know why, I've just forgotten. But the physical model is where you're actually building your databases, right? And you're modeling your data and how that all sits. And then you've got the logical modeling.
Yes,
So
logic. Hmm.
yeah, logical modeling. So when you look at information modeling,
Hmm.
like we know when we look at business modeling, we work at the conceptual level, right? And we try and integrate it with the physical models often.
Hmm.
But there's a piece around the information on how to move it into a physical model. What do you think with information architecture? How does that transition from overall, these are the ideas we have as an
Yeah.
organization to the practical, physical stuff that needs to happen? What are your thoughts?
The conceptual model, this is really important, is that it's the high level. I think it's the same. Undoubtedly, when you move to the physical model, there are outliers and surprises that are going to surface. I don't think that departing from the conceptual model is the biggest deal. It involves increasing funding. From an ontological perspective, the logical model's the last, that's the output.
Yeah,
So the logical model being the last step captures the nuances and the specifics, obviously, about how to map, transform, we could call it crosswalk, define and establish a standard for that model. It's your base standard. Ideally, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit, is the ideal, I think because I'm in that phase of creating right now. The conceptual model is, I never find that I stick completely with the conceptual model all the way through.
Mm.
It's going to change.
Yeah.
Going to change just like the business changes, but as long as it's updated and it's scalable and
Yeah.
extensible, that's the most important thing. So the logical model, I think the most frightening thing is when, and I think early in my career, I did this a couple times, where you paint yourself into a corner and it's
Yeah.
almost impossible to extend or to scale a system because you have specific rules that
Mm.
constrain the ability for
Mm.
the physical system to grow.
Yeah.
I like doing iterative conceptual models that capture, it's almost like a snapshot as the project or the versioning, any sort of ontological model, especially
Yeah.
like for the sake of knowledge graphs. And so I've seen a lot of implementations because I think the synthesis of all of that modeling can really, when you put it into an actual knowledge graph and things don't validate, there could be relationship clashes or loops. So
Mm-hmm.
self-referential loops, and those, then your graph it won't really work. It won't be performant. Your ontology will be broken.
Yeah.
Um, and so the conceptual model is helpful. And I think it's important. I think we all have sort of a duty to update that model as the project progresses in versions.
Mm.
Um,
And
yeah.
for the audience,
Mhm.
we spoke about knowledge graphs.
Yes.
How would you describe knowledge graphs? Because I know that this was quite a big thing on Google and how AI is using knowledge graphs and all of that. But how would you describe it?
So knowledge graph is structured data, usually formed as a knowledge base may have triple stores, for example. So you have a structure that is normally subject, object, predicate. So the idea is you are forming and you're shaping your data not in the constraints of a SQL table, but
Mm.
you are shaping and forming your data to be more of like a matrix shape.
Yeah.
So that you represent classes, relationships, properties, and attributes. So
Mm.
those 4 elements that you'll find within linked data can often be part of that the architecture and NLP. And
Mm.
we see vector databases today trending very heavily, but vectors are a natural output of the ontology, and the ontology structures and it can be an assemblage of more than one ontology. And you don't have to use the entirety of a single published ontology. You can also create your own ontology. And
Mm.
the idea of that is, some of us know it as a labeled property graph. That's another name for it, or named property graph. But there seems to be a lot of confusion right now in the market between a property graph and a knowledge graph. And the distinction is, a knowledge graph is not in SQL. It's not constrained, and it doesn't represent just annotations of tables. That's the distinction.
No, that's really, it's really interesting. The knowledge graph, it, please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is it's almost like an assemble of different types of information to give a context.
Yeah.
And so often what you would do is not just trying to find out one bit, but you're trying to create meaning around the different
Context
types.
and meaning. Yes.
Yes, that's it. And that's significant because when you're working with AI as well, it needs that context and meaning to give
Mhm.
you robust outcomes. Because if you don't have that context, so it all comes back to having some kind of architecture in place to govern. I use the word govern. It's really hard to literally say AI is going to govern, but or is going to be governed, but to really have that overarching view of what it needs to do and understand. And yeah, so it makes a lot of sense to create. It's almost like stories. It's almost, yeah, giving stories.
And the most difficult thing I see people struggle with when creating knowledge graphs and I'm just keying into when you said different types, because yes, there are different types, but again, I say what type? Because and that's the point that most of us have to mature as organizations, and also I think a role that architecture can play is distinguishing what types, because I've seen attempts to build graphs where everything is a type.
Yeah.
And that is very ambiguous because there are many types of things. So just let's define what those things are. And
Mm-hmm.
so the knowledge graphs are not cheap to run. That's the other thing. And approaching it with strategy and understanding that it's that iterative building. So you have your information architecture, you have your labels, you have your taxonomies, you have your catalogs, you have your definitions, then the next step. And that's why I model mostly in SCOS at the beginning,
Mm.
is it's that foundation that will render as a graph.
Yeah.
And that's what's so cool is then when you said concept model, the idea of concept modeling in that domain is okay, I've structured my entire corpus using SCOS. Let's throw it in a graph and see how it renders.
Yeah.
That's concept model one. Then you start building the thesaurus. And so you start connecting those terms just with relationships and definitions. And
Mm.
then you concept model number two, you throw that in a graph. Then you add some heavier ontologies, maybe some of your own organizational schemas. And
Mm-hmm.
so that, in my opinion, is a saner approach and phased approach, so that you don't have that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, we did all this work to build this graph and it's failed and we can't find the needle in the haystack. That's another common pitfall.
That must be so frustrating.
Yeah.
It's like, why?
Because it
Why
is a,
did
yeah.
Oh, so in the next 5 to 10 years, what do you
Mhm.
see happening? There's lots of stuff, obviously. So if we think of the architecture field, enterprise, business, information architecture field, and if we think of AI, which is going to be a reality in our environment, what are your thoughts?
I do believe Gen AI is here and it's how we work with it. I think
Yeah.
the first thing is that we've seen, especially with Adobe, Firefly has been very successful because they've used their own data, but their own images, stock images. But I think right now we're having a little bit of a reckoning. And because, it's been termed, and you've probably heard AI winter,
Yeah.
so I do think that most companies are having to self-reflect,
Mm.
and the promises of AI and the actual delivery of value hasn't been what everyone anticipated. So we
Mm.
have that recoil. I think chatbots are here to stay. I don't know if most of us have forgotten that they were there before. AI is not totally new.
Yeah.
So these chatbots are just getting maybe smarter, but I do think that we will be able to automate some mundane tasks
Yeah.
once I think there's going to be a skilling up,
Mm.
because we've seen and we've proven that we need context. We've seen it and we've proven that most of our data is a mess. So
Yep.
for us to get to the point where we can actually engage with AI, it's not about AI having to learn so much. It's we know those requirements of the system.
Yep.
And we've all been ignoring the fact that our data is a mess. And so we're going to have to take care of our tech debt, and we're going to have to invest in infrastructure. So I
Mm.
do think IA is going to play more of a role. I don't know if the title is going to change again. I would like to see more people from the library and information space being in it and being involved. The library science space is very active, but within their own space. So I think if you do want to see innovation in the AI space or how it's being applied successfully, to maybe start Googling and searching and looking, following what libraries are doing, because they tend to be pretty realistic. Um, and the first thing you learn when you start a library information science program is that you have to be okay with ambiguity.
Yeah.
So I think that's also part of it, is sitting okay with ambiguity.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it.
Mhm.
It's not a little bit of ambiguity, there's a lot. I do think I can definitely see information architecture, whatever the titles end up being, maybe AI information architecture, but I do see a really good synergy on structuring that information far better so that the outputs that you're getting through the different, whatever medium of AI that you're using, actually is structured well and you're
Yeah.
getting the outputs. So I definitely think that my mantra is when you're going to bring in AI, you start with architecture
Yes.
first. You absolutely have to, because otherwise you're just letting it search your bad data. And that's really not going to get you anywhere. It's not going to know what's more important than the other. It's not going to truly understand why you've got 20 spreadsheets and one is more important than the other. How will it know any of this? So you have to create a layer between how you're structuring the information and also deciding how much you want to share with AI, because there's obviously security issues, but also some data is so bad you don't even want to try. There's no.
A really interesting thing that I've been grappling with lately, which is, for example, search engines or tool sets that are integrating with AI. So
Yeah,
your company or has these tools at your disposal, these platforms that you use, and they announce, hey, we've launched this AI module and it's integrated. It's already a black box.
yeah,
And now if my company, what's that risk? That's another thing I think that's really important to look at is if your tool, your platform has integrated with AI, how many models? And then is that going to interfere with if we do something with AI, if we build
yeah.
our.
Mm. It's interesting, and I think people should actually explore not just the big tech players in this. They
Mhm.
should go to the open source, truly open source. um, they should be looking at what these communities are doing, because actually more work is happening in that space, solving little problems and rethinking things. It's amazing communities, Huggy Face, all of those. The stuff that they're coming up with is amazing and it's completely free, and people should be experimenting with that. But they should understand some principles. I think
Yes.
that's obviously important. And not everyone's a programmer, so that becomes challenging for them. But I agree with you. When it's black boxed, it can be challenging for people to truly gain the benefits of AI, number
Yeah.
one. But secondly, have some levels of control as to what that AI is doing for you. It does. The one that says it's going to check my emails for me, I'm like, it's
Yeah.
okay. I don't even let my family check my emails. Why would I let AI check my email unless I
Yeah.
got some dumb account? But it's doing all kinds of things right now. It's phoning people. It's doing all. People need to be wise to what's real and what's not real, and that can be challenging.
And technology in general is dangerous. It can be. And so carrying those same principles forward to that point is important, that we don't let go of ethics and morals and values in this transition. I do believe that what we're experiencing though, I'm not so certain. My own personal experience is that when I've had AI generate content for me, I get so frustrated. It's easier for me to just do it myself at this stage.
Yeah,
Um, and so I do think that there's some sort of happy medium and delegating specific tasks. Like again, even in customer service realm, when there are chatbots, how often are you given a selection of things that are probably being pulled from a catalog, but none of those things work. None of those things really check that box of what you're looking for. And you're just looking for a way to look at the catalog yourself. You're just trying to get out of that AI engaged. And so it's a very ambiguous time right now because we don't know what direction things are going to in, but I think it's fair for those in the field to have opinions.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And people should explore. You should, because nobody actually really truly knows. There are those who know more. But it's a great time to explore, I think, at least. Are there any current opportunities that you see for a role like yours in the industry, or risks?
Risks or opportunities? I think, uh, you mean opportunities in what way? Like opportunities for employment or for
Employment, people always ask that question, so that's one option. I also think, like you mentioned, being multidiscipline, yeah. So collaborating with different groups, what are those opportunities? Which
yeah.
groups? Yeah.
It's a great group. It's more of a knowledge graph centric group that meets every Friday called the Data Worthy. And it's a collection of people. It's really actually a fun group. They meet at 7 a.m. Pacific time. So that's a little bit too early for me, but so I make it when I can. And it's a really vibrant community. I think conversations throughout the internet. I know that there's another podcast learning site that the AI Digest, which is very with Joaquin Malera. He has these forums and get-togethers, which are nice, I think, to check out. And it's just a meeting of the minds. The conferences, there's some great conferences. Knowledge Graph conference is wrapping up. And unfortunately, I couldn't join because I was with my son for his 18th birthday. But there's some really great opportunities to learn. Data Day Texas, which I was the keynote at this last year, it is such a cool conference because it's not affiliated with any vendors. Great opportunity.
When is that?
Data Day Texas is January. So this last year,
When-
it's in Austin, Texas. And it's just a 1 day event that's just so vibrant and exciting and so much dialogue and some great minds. And so I think it's the most vendor-free conference I've ever been to, which sort of it takes away from those distractions, which is
Yeah,
nice.
I can see the value of that because you get so consumed by so many different things, and it's hard to tell the wood from the trees sometimes. But yeah.
Yeah, it's overwhelming. And so I think opportunities like I go back to that library science. I am writing a book right now
Oh,
because
awesome.
on this domain really. There's very few. And from the writing I've done and work I've done in the past, it's just a collection of all those the learnings and practices because there's not really a published book on step by step how do I start and where do I go.
That's awesome. Do you have a due date yet, or is it still in progress?
It's in progress. So it's a year. I have my first two chapters due in a week.
Okay,
I've been working
exciting.
on, but it is called intentional arrangement. So the idea that we should bring, and I think that is something that I've been thinking about and writing about for the past year is that the act of instead of having ChatGPT, not that there's anything wrong with it, but the act of actually talking to people within your organization and creating your own structure that represents the nomenclature and the ideas within, it's critical. It's an intentional act of basically creating your business's digital fingerprint.
Yeah,
So there's nothing that
that
can
sounds
replace.
awesome. That does
Yeah,
sound awesome. And I like the fact that you bring in the human factor into this because really businesses are little worlds, little human worlds. I think that sounds good. So do keep everyone updated when you do finally release it, and good luck with that. I know it must be quite a lot of work to go through, but also very exciting.
very exciting.
Uh, all right. So those entering the field, if somebody
Yes.
is going, this sounds like the job for me, what advice would you give them?
I would, well, first of all, I would say to enroll in some sort of library program. They have certificate programs as well because the field encompasses so much. So within information and data architecture, again, if you're going with controlled vocabularies and then the progression, so you'd want to learn how to build controlled vocabularies and what the standards and protocols are. And then everything's iterative. So
Mhm.
then you're building taxonomies, glossaries, catalogs, thesauri, then you get into ontologies, knowledge graphs. So that's like a good 6 tiers and understanding how schemas work and metadata. I took an entire year in grad school of metadata. And what's interesting is that understanding it's a very holistic, multidisciplinary field. You're not going to get it. It's not some it's usually overwhelming for most people. So I think it's helpful to take a course, to maybe enroll in a certificate program, not that's necessary. Look for internships. They do exist. And even starting off, like when I throughout my life, I've helped people build sites. I've offered up my services, and sometimes, and I do find this is helpful for some people that I've mentored, is simply offering up your services to build a small business site is
Mm.
great experience. Like nothing should be beneath you when
Yeah,
getting started in this field because it's a skill set that builds and grows.
that's great advice. Just give it a go. Just
Mhm,
do something because that's a reflection of your ability, right? So
mhm.
it's not just get going and do it.
There's a free there is a no there's several free knowledge graph courses through
Mm.
open source institutions, and I don't have the names offhand right now, but those can be really helpful too.
Yeah.
Um, just immersing yourself.
Okay, awesome. We'll get some of those links from you as well, share with the group. I think that'll be awesome. One last question I have for you, and this has been an awesome discussion. I really have appreciated a little bit of geek speak. That's been good. If you could go back in time and give your younger self a piece of advice, what would it be?
To not doubt your ability. I think that's the most important thing within this space. I think making the transition from I used to be an academic librarian and transitioned into technology because my concentration was informatics. So I delayed going to grad school because we can think of all of these obstacles. And my heart was telling me I wanted to go. It took a good 4 to 5 years before I actually went. So whatever you have your heart set on, that you can make it. I know this sounds really cheesy, that you should just go for it at this moment because there's always going to be obstacles. Even when joining an organization, you're the new person. It's hard because there's a lot you're having to get to know a whole new landscape. Those challenges are constant. That's what life is. So I wish it's not to be afraid of taking those risks.
Mm, that's great advice. Just I like to say to people, the least you'll get out of it is you'll have learned.
Yeah.
Like that's the least you'll get out of it, and that's pretty good outcome. It might not be the outcome you want, but you will that's guaranteed at a minimum. This
And
has
it's
been a
because, like, what I was gonna say is, like, we can throw the one thing that I find a lot of people in the field, they're, "Oh, school's too expensive. I can't afford it. I have to get loans. Where am I gonna" That sort of conversation, that self-doubt talk, I think is more destructive than the student loan or the investing your time.
yeah. And there's also a lot of opportunities for people who I always think a professional institution like a university is the best way to go. It gives you the most credibility.
Yeah,
But if you absolutely cannot do that, there's so many free courses out there where you can start educating yourself.
good point.
And yeah, and eventually get to that point where you can start working and then ask maybe your team to help you with a scholarship or something like that to get the accreditation you need. But yeah, there's almost no excuse not to
Yeah,
learn right now. I'd say almost because I think some things are a little guided. There's
yeah.
so much.
I
Mm,
think honoring curiosity and passion,
yeah,
those are
absolutely.
2 human traits that I think are essential to life. Yeah.
Jessica, it's been awesome. I really like talking about data. I like talking about library services. I like talking about all of these things. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what is the best way to do that? Uh,
Yes. Find me on LinkedIn, and I can also share my email address. I have an email address for contacts, but definitely if you want to message me through LinkedIn, that's probably the best way right now. Yeah.
yes, that's
Mhm.
awesome. So thank you so much for joining me today. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope the audience enjoys this very robust conversation around information architecture, which is a little bit different to what we have before. So I'm super excited to get your insights on this.
Great. Thank you, Deirdre. I appreciate it.